Welcome to all. As you know, this is our third external advisory committee meeting. And in our committee, we have a set of great friends. I see all of them here they are helping us immensely with their advice on research, organization, and programs. As you know, the mission of CBMM is research on the science and the engineering of intelligence. And our priority is the science, and as an integral part of it, the education of great young scientists. Hi, Christoph. In this interdisciplinary field, studying what I think is the greatest problem in science today, the problem of intelligence. So we should and we are aware of the social implications of studying and eventually replicating aspects of human intelligence in machines. In fact, some of us, as Max Tegmark, who may come later, with his Future of Life Institute Foundation, have been pioneers in working to ensure that tomorrow's most powerful technologies, like artificial intelligence, are beneficial for humanity. So when I saw a few weeks ago an op-ed in the New York Times by David Siegel about AI and jobs, essentially, I asked him on behalf of the External Advisory Committee to help us start a discussion within CBMM and between CBMM and the rest of MIT eventually about AI and jobs. And to have an informed discussion, I asked an expert, Andrew McAfee, to help running it. So today's event is, I hope, the preview of a bigger symposium that CBMM may organize a few months from now at MIT. By the way, as you will hear today, autonomous driving will threaten a lot of jobs in the US. And so in the typical dialectic of the Illuminists we all are, we have a talk tomorrow by another EAC member, Amnon Shashua, on the future of autonomous driving. So let me introduce you formally, although several of you know him already, both David and Andrew. So David first. David is the co-founder of Two Sigma Investment. I'm quoting to some magazine. This is a quantitative trading powerhouse that is the fastest growing hedge fund in the business. Data-driven, absorb large amount of information to predict the prices of securities, ranging from stocks to future contracts. You are described in this magazine as a computer fanatic who received a computer science PhD from MIT and worked at hedge funds, some of the best ones like D. Shaw and Tudor Investment Group. And the memory I have of David were 20 years ago or more, on the 7th floor of the building over there where the AI lab was. He was, I remember him with pieces of robots in his hands. He was a friendly and smart presence there. Somebody which was great to have around in the tradition of, smart and fun people in the AI lab. And then years afterwards, I had lost contact with him when somebody in the fund of fund business called me to ask me about David. They were doing some extreme vetting of David, of Two Sigma, before investing in them. This was the year 2000, 2001. And I said, he's a good guy. You can trust him. I was asked at the time, because I was involved at the time in a hedge fund, by far not as successful as Two Sigma. But I'm sure the part of the reason I was involved in finance is something I have in common with David. Developing a machine that can beat the market is one of the most stringent Turing tests for intelligence you can think about, or super intelligence. You're competing with other humans. So in particular, being able to develop algorithms that predict well, not only past data, but also predict the future of the market is the most difficult test for machine learning, and is a microcosm of what science is about. Science is about generating predictive models from data. David. So we share that. And Andrew is a great guy who has done great work across the street at Sloan School. And I always look forward to conference with speaking, because it's always not only fun, but is extremely interesting. Has been studying digital economy, how technologies are changing business and society. He's the co-author with Eric Brynjolfsson, of course I know Eric, but pronouncing his name is still difficult, of the 2014 bestseller, The Second Machine Age, and the more recent Race Against the Machines, The Machine. He received his PhD from Harvard Business School, or a doctorate, and 2 Masters of Science and 2 Bachelor of Science at MIT. So his blog is highly recommended. He writes for a number of publications, including Financial Times, The Economist, and so on. So I'm sure I can put all of this in your hands, and it will be very interesting. Thank you for coming.
Absolutely. Tommy, thank you for that. Tommy asked me to kick off very quickly, but we're going to segue as soon as I can manage it into a conversation between me and David. First of all, because I have had questions I've wanted to ask him for a long time, but then we're going to open it up and we're going to talk as a group about some of these issues. I want to start off by echoing just a couple things that Tommy said. First of all, Tommy, I agree that unlocking consciousness is the greatest problem in science these days. What's interesting to me, because I'm not a scientist of intelligence, according to a lot of my colleagues, what's fascinating to me is that as we unlock this challenge progressively, the economic and the social consequences of getting better at figuring out intelligence and building machines that can do more and more intelligence-like things, it appears to a lot of us that those consequences are profound, and I'm absolutely of that view. In academia, we talk about doing cross-disciplinary work a lot, and I put air quotes around that to indicate that it doesn't happen very often. The CBMM is one place where it absolutely happens. What I've learned, though, over the past couple years is this topic about what's happening. Are the robots, I'll say it in a flip way, are the robots actually eating all of the jobs? This topic actually draws in a truly cross-disciplinary group from throughout the Institute. And there is, I say this with some hometown pride, there is no better place on the planet to have these conversations than MIT, because whatever I find myself wanting to get smarter about, one of the world's best and most experienced people on the topic is down the hallway or across campus. So it's an absolute playground for these issues. I'm going to kick off today by doing something that I feel is in the best MIT fashion. I'm just going to bombard you all with a bunch of data, and because that's kind of how we like to learn here. When I'm done with that, then we're going to take it easy and we're going to segue into a conversation with David. And what I tried to do, and this is an echo of a presentation I gave at a conference that Tommy and I and a couple other people were at a while back, was to try to assemble an initial frequently asked questions on what's going on here at this intersection of tech progress and jobs and wages. So the first question that I get asked all the time is, okay, what actually is going on at this intersection? And the only honest answer is a whole lot of things are. To me, one of the central phenomenon is what's been called the polarization or the hollowing out of the workforce in America and lots of other countries. So to show some data on that, I want to rely on work that was done by our MIT colleague David Otter in the economics department, who's just done a large volume of wonderful work on questions having to do with the labor force around the world, but particularly in America. This was a paper that he published in 2015, and I'm going to recreate my favorite data representation, my favorite graph that David drew in this, because I think he took a brilliant approach to helping us understand how the American workforce is changing. And what he did was essentially look at all of the jobs in the United States in 1979. And he lined them up from lowest paid to highest paid. And then right there in the middle is the American middle class. And in 1979, we had a really large, stable, prosperous middle class. I look at it as one of the crowning achievements of American society and the society of other rich countries around the world. And then what David did was he then played the tape forward in more recent years. And what he was looking at was not how the raw volume of jobs evolved, but if you like, how the market share of jobs was changing from time period to time period. And what that led to was lines that look like this. So this is what happened between 1979 and 1989. And the way to think about this is every time you see an area below that red line, that's where the market share of those kinds of jobs went down. So there are proportionally fewer Americans doing those kinds of jobs. Every time you see an area above that red line, that's where the market share of jobs increased. So does that intuition make sense? God, I love MIT. You can just do that very easily. No, that's some flavor of typo. I'm not deliberately elongating that axis. I have no idea what happened there, and you have very sharp eyes.
I think it's only
It's a half zero. You have even sharper eyes. Okay, so ignore the final number on the axis there. So look at that picture. Between 79 and 89, I find this a really happy story because the American economy was proportionally losing jobs down there at the lower levels of pay and doing a really good job of creating middle class, upper middle class, pretty high-end jobs. I find this a pretty happy story. And then what I want to do is draw more versions of this line for more recent time periods. And then you're going to start to notice something different. So keep your eyes primarily on that bulge of where the jobs are where market share is going away. What kinds of jobs are we proportionally losing? And you're going to notice one fairly consistent phenomenon. So now let's go from 89 to 99, and you start to see that bulge of job loss is moving upward in the wage range, in the skill range, starting to eat kind of into the heart of the middle class. And we started to create these lousy jobs down there at the absolute lowest pay range. You know, there's still some pretty good jobs being created here. The next time period I find very strange. This is what happened between 99 and 2000. And it's a story of complete blech in the economy, except for generating a lot of very lousy jobs down at the fairly low end. So the rest of the economy kind of flatlined, and we were generating lots of jobs down there. And in other work, David has looked into what kind of jobs those were. These are not low-end manufacturing jobs. These are in-person service jobs. I always think of home health aid as the classic job somewhere down there. Very important to do right. Despite the work of people in this room, we don't have robots that can do that yet. But it's an 8 to 10 hour, dollar an hour, no set schedule, no benefits, no health care kind of job. So I put it down there in that fairly lousy category. Yep, so this is stable at the 1979 distribution of job slash wage or skill, which are interchangeable here. No other audience asks questions of this level of detail. This makes me incredibly happy. And then for the most recent years, we have data. This starts to make a little bit more sense to me. We're starting to see the high-end jobs come back. So this is the data scientist, user experience designer economy. There's a lot of really good high-end upper middle class, upper class jobs being created. But look at that bulge of where the job loss is happening. For me, this is right squarely in the heart of the classic American middle class. So I love this representation because it just shows what's been happening in the workforce over time. After I try to communicate this, the most common question that I get is, okay, are we deeply weird as an economy? And it turns out that we're not, because thanks to some other interesting work, no. Thanks to some other interesting work, if you look across a large group of European companies, this is a different way to look at the same kind of data. So for every one of these countries, there were 3 lines: low-paid jobs, middle-paid jobs, high-paid jobs. Let's look at how that shifted around, in this case, between 93 and 2010. And the phenomenon is incredibly consistent. All these countries lost jobs in the middle class. There's a mix of whether they gained them down low or up high, but this hollowing out of the middle class is an extremely consistent phenomenon. The next question I get asked all the time is, okay, is this a China and outsourcing a globalization story? Yes, to some extent, but I actually think the main answer is no, it's not. Let me show you one way that I think about this. This is a graph of America's manufacturing output over time. And what you learn from this is that the crisis in American manufacturing has nothing to do with output. We are a large and growing manufacturing economy over a pretty long period of time. China is now the world's largest manufacturer. We're number 2, and nobody else is coming close. Our manufacturing output these days is as large as that of Germany, India, France, and Italy combined. We're a big manufacturing economy. Aha! That's what we call a segue, because the next line I'm going to add is U.S. manufacturing jobs. And the year of peak manufacturing employment in the United States was 1979. So the kind of easy conversation about the crisis in manufacturing is, if anything, it's a jobs crisis, not an output crisis. And you just see this, in recent years. The most recent data shows that this little happy rise is actually tailing off and heading in the other direction as well. So we do not have an output crisis. We have an employment situation that's changing very quickly. David and a colleague, again, looked at this situation and said, okay, what is going on? And I place a lot of weight on what David says for a couple reasons. One, he's a first-rate economist. Second of all, he is not as big. I see a computer under every rock. I see a robot everywhere I look. David doesn't. So when he comes to a conclusion like this, when he looked at what was happening with the shift in jobs in America, when he comes to a conclusion like this, it makes me really happy, because he makes the point correctly that the American middle class was built on the back of routine work, routine physical work, assembly line, routine cognitive work, payroll clerk. We have robots and automation and pieces of software that are really good at all that routine work, and that explains the changes that we've been seeing in the labor force. David and his colleague looked at a bunch of other factors. They did really lovely work here, and they said, look, these other things they don't appear to be central to the story that's going on here. This is a story about fairly, by the standards of folk in this room, fairly dumb pieces of technology substituting for routine work throughout a pretty big industrialized economy. The next question I get asked all the time is, okay, well, you're telling me a story about robots eating all of the jobs, and yet we have less than 5% unemployment in America. What's going on? Something doesn't seem to make sense. And the robots eating jobs is a pretty naive way to look at it. What any economist would say is, if the price of something goes down, the price of hiring somebody, or if demand for that thing goes down, it's not the case that we use absolutely none of it. It's just the case we're willing to pay less for it. And in particular, if we have a combination of factors, you're not going to have mass unemployment. You're going to have something else. So if your labor force is fairly flexible and your economy is growing, that's kind of a recipe for job growth. And we should keep in mind the American economy has been adding net jobs month by month, every month for, I believe, more than 6 years now. So we are not in any mass unemployment crisis. We have the most flexible labor force across the Rich Countries Club of the OECD. And what that means is that the top line there is just raw economic growth, just real GDP per capita. And what you notice is, as the economy grows, the raw number of jobs grows almost in lockstep with that. It's almost a one-to-one relationship. The gap between those two lines is just greater productivity over time. So we're absolutely adding jobs. The problem, when you hollow out the middle class, is that on average, the jobs that you're creating are not as good as they used to be. So if you look at that 50th percentile American family or household, you see that it has really stalled out. There's a little bit of encouraging news in recent years, but the American 50th percentile family has been stuck since at least the turn of the century at a flat level of income. Probably as we look harder, the situation looks even worse than that. There's one little wrinkle in this story about why we don't have mass unemployment. There actually is one concentrated demographic where we do have pretty serious unemployment in America. And again, it is right there in what I think of as the heart of the American middle class. It is prime age men who grew up during kind of brawny, stereotypically masculine labor in factories. Those jobs go away. What those people do not do in general is take the job as a home health aide. What they do instead is start sitting on the sidelines of the economy. So this measures the percentage of prime age American men who either have a job or are looking for a job. That's labor force participation, if you're in one of those two categories. If you're not, you're part of this falling off here. Fully 12% of prime age U.S. don't have a job and are not looking for a job. They're purely on the sidelines of the economy. Like we can imagine, that is even more concentrated among the least educated prime age American men. So very close to 20% of high school or less educated American men are absolutely on the sidelines of the economy. And that I consider to be actually mass unemployment among a pretty important demographic. There are a lot of these people, for one thing. Last thing I want to talk about is, second to last thing. It depends on age. It depends really heavily on age. So if you're talking about men in their 40s and 50s, most of them, this is a little bit of speculation. I would imagine most of them had a job earlier in their careers. One of the weirder phenomenon is American men, especially less educated, starting their, what I used to think of as their careers, but never having at all. There's been some research that came out of the University of Chicago that I find pretty crazy. He looked pretty hard at American men in their 20s. He found a mass unemployment or labor force participation crisis, and he looked at what they actually did with their time. Yep, video games. They play games an absurd number of hours a week, and when you ask them about their life satisfaction, they're thrilled. They're having a great time. I'm going to show you some data in a minute that points in the other direction, but when you ask these people, they say, man, it's great. I love my World of Warcraft people. Anyway, yeah, please. Wow, this is the best segue audience I've ever had. So let me talk about the consequences and the causes of it, because they're all bundled together. And I want to be really careful based on what you just said. It is tempting and incorrect to tell very simple stories about cause and effect here. There are a bunch of rich phenomena. They're all intersecting and feeding off each other. And economists love to talk about causal density, which is their fancy way of saying there's a lot going on here. So I want to emphasize there's a lot going on here. And I just want to talk about correlations instead of clear cause and effects. It would be very hard to assess clear cause and effect, and I don't think the research has done that yet. So I want to show some correlations, and then we can, David and I and all of us can speculate about what we think the causes are. But let me show you some other things that are going on at the same time as these phenomena, please. So this is the number that I walk around with about people who are out of the labor force, just not even trying to participate anymore. So what are some of the consequences here? And let me say this one more time. I'm going to show some things that are correlated with lots of technology and computers proliferating. I am not saying that computers are causing all of these things. I find it important to be clear about this, because I'm going to show some data that, quite frankly, I find terrifying. One of the things that's going on is a recently understood rise in mortality that was unexpected, is bizarrely large, and is extremely bad news. Angus Deaton won the prize in 2015, and he and Susan Case, instead of going on vacation for 4 years, which is what I think I do, they dove into the data on mortality among different groups in America. And one of the happiest phenomena on the planet is that almost no matter what demographic group you look at in any part of the world, rates, mortality are going down. They're going down very quickly. The world is getting a lot healthier. Deaton and Case found an exception to that, which just makes my jaw drop. This is research they just published. I'm going to reproduce a graph that came out in the journal today or yesterday. This is mortality. This is only America. This is mortality for African Americans. And again, going down, we like that. Hispanic, going down, we like that. These are least educated whites in America. Their death rates are going up. So much so that for this line is causing the mortality rate of white Americans to go up. This is a reversal of the trend that was happening before. We were not aware of it. We were not expecting it. And it's happening no matter what age we're looking at. So I don't know how happy those people are, but they're clearly dying at a higher rate. This is extremely atypical compared to other wealthy countries. Even countries are getting healthier quite quickly. U.S. whites have a completely different pattern than populations in other wealthy countries. And the causes are really tightly clustered. These are not due primarily to obesity. They're not due to poor diet. They're due to three main causes: suicide, acute alcohol and drug intoxication, overdosing, and chronic liver disease.
How big is that segment of it?
It's white Americans are 62% of the American population. So let me say that a different way. If you look at the difference in mortality trend for the least educated white Americans versus what's actually been happening, the change between the old trend and what's actually happened is larger in magnitude than the AIDS epidemic. So for example, there were more opioid deaths due to overdose in America last year than there were deaths in America from AIDS at the peak of the epidemic in 1995. So these numbers add up very quickly, and it's an absolute public health crisis. If that's not distressing enough to everybody, I've got more good news for you. There's other really interesting work about this, what Charles Murray has called the coming apart of American society. And he's, we can disagree with some of his views. He's an extremely careful digger into different social data. So let me show some graphs that he put in his book, Coming Apart. When he had this really clever idea to not think of the American middle class as one big homogeneous group, but to look at what's been happening essentially at the top 20% of the American middle class versus the bottom 30%. So, you know, upper middle class families like a lot of ours, frankly, and then very lower middle class families. He stereotypes them. He calls the upper middle class town the archetypal town Belmont, and Fishtown lower middle class whites live. And he looks at things like the divorce rates. And you're going to see this very common pattern across the data here. Upper middle class white Americans, the residents of Belmont, live just like they did a half a century ago. We are still in kind of Eisenhower, Leave It to Beaver era America. Lower middle class American families are living substantially different lives, and usually in directions that terrify me. So divorce rates are going way up. In Fishtown, about a third of kids now are living with both of their biological parents. In Belmont, that rate has been steady for 30 or 40 years. The white imprisonment rate skyrocketed among lower middle class Americans, while none of us are going to jail anytime soon. Just for context, the reason Murray was concentrating on white Americans here, I think he was tired of getting called a racist. So he was trying to show that the phenomena he were interested in were not just about African Americans. One other thing that's going on here is a rise in what this book calls the politics of resentment. This I found a fascinating book. This is a sociologist who, for a few years now, started hanging out. She's from Wisconsin. She's at Madison. She started hanging out in rural, white, lower middle class communities in Wisconsin. And early in 2016, before the presidential campaign heated up at all, she published this book and talked about just the simmering, ongoing resentment that she kept coming across among people in these communities who were not economically devastated, but they just felt like things had been changed. The bargain had been perverted for them, and that she kept on feeling this overwhelming sense of resentment. Where does that take us? That's Nigel Farage, who was the head of the Brexit vote in the UK, and that's our president right now. I don't have to look too hard before I find signs that societies where the middle class has been getting hollowed out tend to do more populist things when they have a chance to express their resentment via the vote. All right, that's the end of the politics here. The last question that I want to talk about are things going to get better? And there's a really stark difference in opinion among some of the smartest people that I get to talk to about the topic. And a lot of the very smart people say, look, yes. You're falling into the trap of being a Luddite 200 years after the fact. And what we know about the forces of entrepreneurship and innovation and capitalism is that they find new things for people to do. And the pattern for 200 years of the industrial era has been a very clear pattern. Very steadily rising wages, standards of living, incomes for average workers over time. Their kids did better than they did. And yeah, we're going through a rough period now, but if we make some tweaks to the system maybe, and make the engines of innovation and entrepreneurship work better, we can get back to a better place. The argument from history would say that things are going to be fine. The argument on the other side says absolutely not. So you can either underestimate the power of capitalism or you can underestimate the power of technology. I think they're both very, very strong forces. The argument on the no side is that we're underestimating how powerful technology is, and in particular, what we are now able to do, which is build technologies that escape that box of routine work, where they've been for kind of the entire computer era, and start going out and doing things that we used to need human beings to do, including very highly skilled, very intelligent human beings. Computers are better at that stuff now. So this view kind of says that we ain't seen nothing yet with technology's impact on the labor force, on the economy, and probably on society at large. With that, I want to stop talking. David, would you mind joining me and let's carry this conversation on? And hey, Mark. Yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you for that question. This is a talk geared for a very specific audience, the ones sitting in this room. I don't feel like I need to tell or try to communicate to this group that tech progress is a beneficial force. So I was concentrating on some of the challenging consequences of it. I couldn't agree more with you that robots and computers and AI and these other things are essential for us to do. They're incredibly powerful tools. They will make us wealthier overall. The challenge, I believe, is that the way we used to divvy up that wealth is shifting kind of quickly.
Is that an article of faith? Or it seems to be pure and simple an article?
Every economist that I talk to says that technological progress is the only free lunch that they believe in. And what they mean by that is there's no other route to higher productivity than going through technological progress. And higher productivity, by definition, is awesome because it lets us do more with less. And why might higher productivity be bad? And one reason, and David, come on, let's sit down and talk.
You know, what I would say to that question is, and maybe we should turn off the projector.
As fond as I am of our book cover, I don't think we need it in the background all the time.
I think really the discussion has more to do with work, and or really even more basically the future of what people will be doing with their time. And you know, so all this progress is all good. But on the other hand, and you know, there's much to say here. Other people have to also consider and think about the adjustment that will be needed in the world to essentially satisfy the needs of human beings, and to do that. And one of the reasons you asked me earlier, why did I begin to start to think about this problem, which is very much related to your question. So I'm in an AI background. I'm in the investment world, and and in a way, I kind of got pushed into this problem by people peppering me with questions. They expected to do something about this because I was thinking about investing, thinking about the power of using AI to make investments, and that somehow I would have predictions about all of this going forward because of how I'm sort of in this particular circle. And quite frankly, I didn't have any views whatsoever, but I started to wonder. And for example, this is something that really I think amplified the problem we have. So one of the things we do is venture investing in the tech sector. And so I'm looking at venture deal after venture deal. And every 90% of them are about automating away some kind of human activity. And if you then start to read about how companies deploy capital, so the investment world is accused, so, of being very biased to short-term quarterly improvements in performance of a business. And generally, the best way to get a better quarterly result is through tried and true automation. To invent something new, to create a new market, that's actually pretty hard. And you're not going to do that in a couple of months. Yeah. But on the other hand, you could deploy some new software, or you could put a robot on your assembly line, and you're almost guaranteed to get
costs go down, margin goes up, things look better.
That's right. And so as I start to digest sort of the economic world that I'm in, I'm concluding that we have an imbalance where basically, in some very strange way, it appears that we're all collectively trying to eliminate human work, and that no one in particular is thinking, well, what would be things to replace the activity with? There appear to be no, in fact, the economic incentives are, again, to replace human work.
Let me ask you, I have a mic on. Oh. Let me ask you the toughest question that I get asked all the time, because I'm going to steal your answer to it. What about the fact that for 200 years, a succession of allegedly smart people has been saying some version of what you just said and what I believe as well, and for 200 years, we have been dead flat wrong, and what we keep on underestimating is the fact that all these new technologies, all these new companies, all these new in aggregate need a lot of people and
Right.
provide enough new jobs and good livings.
Well, first of all, I think it goes back to the nature of work. Let me just make a simple analogy about imagine that you have an economy of dogs, right? And so dogs, I don't have one, but I used to, have certain unmet needs. They need dog food. They need a flea collar. They need certain things. But after a while, the dog's life is good. They don't need anything more. I mean, you can try to give a dog an iPhone, but they're not going to appreciate it. And I think it would be very difficult if our jobs were to create a growing economy around ever increasing dog GDP, because dogs are dogs, right? I mean, it makes perfect sense. Well, we could. That's a good idea. We can do that. Well, actually, in New York City, in fact, we specialize in increasing the GDP around dogs because, right? But it's not really going to go very far.
That might not spread too far outside the Upper East
Yeah,
Side.
we have like the dog walkers. We can automate that, maybe robot dog walkers. But the point being that so you've made the horse example where eventually horses are no longer, you're probably familiar with that. I'm going at it from the other way around.
From the demand side.
From the demand side. And so I think so that's a dog. Well, let's talk about humans. Humans are like a dog in that we have actually a limit, I believe, which people are not being very candid about, a limit to our own demand. So for example, there are only so many electronic gadgets that you want to own. There are only so many books you can read. There are only so many vacations you can go on, so many back rubs you can get. So eventually you hit a point where we are overwhelmed with only so much food to eat, and so on the demand side, we've done a great job in our economy, and we've actually perfected the automation to make the demand efficient. And so the question is, and I think this is, I strongly believe that we're actually, at least in the U.S., for most of the population, we are basically meeting the needs and the demand of humans. And so unless we evolve into some radically different species where we have eyes on the back of our heads and in the front and we can watch two movies at the same time, there's a limit to this. And so I think and I think in part this is why so much of the venture activity that I see is focused on substitution. Because in fact, they're not going to really invent something new that we're going to do because no one, has the time to do it.
It's just easier for them to say, I can automate a radiologist away.
That's right.
Okay.
And much harder to invent a new activity because first of all, that new activity would have to, because it has to steal your time from some other activity, it's a bigger quantum to get people to adopt it.
Let's have the rule of not having any rules. I would love to keep this conversation as broad as possible. I have questions I want to pepper you with, but let's please.
The universal basic income concept is favored on the West Coast, and so another thing that, by the way, that drew me into this debate was when I meet with my fellow tech crowd, the entrepreneurial crowd. I'm very surprised at how unconcerned they are with this problem.
They're a little blithe about the whole thing, aren't they?
They really are.
Yeah.
And
can I paraphrase?
Yes, please.
They kind of think that mass joblessness is coming, but it'll be all Burning Man all the time. It's just going to kind of feel, we're just going to go party all the. Is that about right?
That's right. Or maybe we'll just give people endless entertainment. And somehow that will let them eat cake kind of thing, but what I notice is it's the people who are suggesting this are the people with rewarding jobs, and 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 so
They've got some of the coolest jobs in the world,
that's
right?
And so I don't think that there, and look, we have evolved over how many years? I mean,
Lots.
millions really. And basically, I think we are, and this is beyond the scope of my knowledge, but I suspect we are hardwired to want to work, because we wouldn't have actually survived if that were not the case. So we probably are going against our basic genetic programming if we are basically going to tell people, now you can just sit around all day and you don't have to do anything and you'll be just fine and dandy.
We kind of rebel against that at a genetic level.
I don't. Do you want to do that? I don't want to do that.
Not for more than a couple of days.
I'm not so sure it will be a big problem taking care of the people. At least depend. I agree with you but the question I would ask. Okay, that's an implementation problem, and it's very worthy of debate. And I don't think we're doing the right things. And I could make some suggestions, but it's a complicated problem. But I would just start with the question of, are we able to do that? So is there, for example, enough wealth in America to, if we distributed it the right way, and if people weren't squandering it on the wrong activities and so on, could we basically have everyone, but by the way, you need a measure of success. So what is the metric that we're using here? Is it GDP? I would argue that, by the way, that's part of what's causing the problem. The GDP is not the right measure to be focused on. Is it a happiness index? So part of this is a measurement issue, and I think that we do not have in our society the right metrics for gauging. The charts that you put up, I think, are interesting and clearly bad indicators. But overall, how would you come up with a couple of numbers to indicate whether or not an economic policy is really what society wants?
And it's interesting, our economic dashboard is pretty bad because that mortality increase was unknown until a year or two ago. So the dashboard that we were looking at didn't pick up on that pretty important signal.
Well, that's interesting. But then you could also, but again, these are again important questions for society given the era that we're in. Arguably, we could say the most important thing to do in society is to extend life. And that we should be devoting more and more resources to that problem, because now that we've, no one's starving, or maybe, we should be expending more money actually on virtual reality, because even though your life may not be so long, you'll enjoy it more. And so this question of how to your point, how do we redefine not only the future of work, I would say, but it related to this is how society allocates its resources to solve what it perceives are the important problems. And that is changing given the fact that most of our basic unmet needs are met.
Are now getting met. Hold on a second. Go ahead, please. Let me. This is a fundamental point. Well done that. Why? I get asked this question all the time. So again, I'm putting this on you. Where does your intuition or your confidence comes from that we're heading into an era that's characterized more by substitution of automation for people than by complementarity, than by like awesome robot surgery, but with the person still there?
Well, I think in the business world, I think that certainly from what I've observed, people have found that it is easier to just substitute, to think of the problem as a substitution problem than as obviously it sounds much nicer to say that you're going to be building software that will just, empower the human workers to do better.
Which is what every CEO I've ever talked to says.
Yeah, now they're not telling you the truth. because in fact, that problem actually, that's hand waving. Because it's very, so in other words, what they're saying is they're going to design a whole new set of tools that a sort of an average skilled worker can now use these incredible tools and achieve much, much more. So on the other hand, what if you could design the tool to just completely replace the worker and be done with it? So you're going to first try to do that. And again, this goes back to the nature of work. So the tasks that people, to your point, the tasks that people are doing in business really aren't actually changing that much. I'll talk. Yeah, yeah.
Mark, how far away is that robot?
People are working on unloading trucks.
Can you ballpark that for us? Is it a 5-year or 10-year problem? 5-ish.
But again, to your earlier point, what stops a lot of the end mile automation is simply that the human labor becomes very cheap, and so the last thing that automated
cheap stuff.
are the cheap stuff that humans can do. And really, I mean, humans are actually at some level very flexible for an unstructured environment, and robots will get there. Mark is speeding up the advances here. It will happen sooner than people think, but clearly, basically, I think humans are increasingly going to be thrown into the jobs that Mark Rabert
That's left over.
That he didn't get to yet.
Is my intuition, can I ask one quick follow-up question? Is my intuition correct that you and your colleagues are making faster progress than you used to at having these machines do useful things in the real world? But I'm curious, you said like the truck loading, unloading robot's 5-ish years away? That sounds like fast progress.
But Mark, even though it's true that I mean, compared to a human mechanism, robots are still primitive. But the nature of we're not talking here about a theoretical problem of in a specially designed competition who's more flexible, a human or a robot. Okay, I mean that it'll be a long time before robots get there. What we're actually talking about is the nature of work, okay, and what is actually going on today. And so, as I think for most applications, the activities are surprisingly easy to automate. And even in China right now, things that were not automated because labor was so cheap are very rapidly being automated. In Wall Street, the hundreds of thousands of jobs in middle office and back office functions, again to your point, that were middle class jobs, people adding up numbers, people updating ledgers, and so on. These jobs have silently gone away over the past 20 years. And what have they been replaced with? They've been replaced with home health care workers and so on. This is because the automation needed for Wall Street, it turns out, is actually pretty simple stuff. And in most cases, by the way, we're not talking about AI. We're just talking about some decent software. So I've spent a little bit of time exploring exactly the question with officials from the government, officials from industry, and so on. And so I've come up with a very depressing conclusion. So number one, the people like the people in this room that actually have the ability to think very clearly about trends and by the way, a lot of the problem is you have people like Kurzweil who are exaggerating things to a point where it creates mass confusion, and then the policymakers and others don't even know what. Right? I mean, so I think that I know him. He's a smart guy, but I don't think he's being helpful in making policy decisions. So then you have the people, the policymakers, the people that are running major businesses, even industrial business, that actually sort of lack the perspective that every one of you have in this room. And the gap is especially large in the government. And so when, for example, the government is trying to formulate trade policies, tax policy, they should read some of David Artur's work. Another thing, I'm jumping around a bit, but very much related. It is surprising to me, and this was part of my own path to my thinking on the matter, how little basic research people are doing on the problem. David is one of the few,
and he's been a great exception for a long time.
That's right.
We were kind of slow to this party.
So I think that if I were to make a few suggestions, first of all, more basic research is needed. Economic research is needed in these trends. Secondly, the community of people that are involved with the development of these technologies have to offer more level-headed assessments as to where the technologies are going, to not confuse the people that are making policy decisions. And the list is much longer, but I'll start with those two.
Bob and then Tommy, please.
Well, some of it is a function of a culture, and so if a culture, and I don't know anything at all. I'm really just making this up, but so full disclaimer here. But different societies, I've traveled the world. When you look at Japan versus America versus Germany versus, the nature of work differs considerably in each of these societies, and So I would not immediately conclude that we cannot shape, perhaps with, in fact, not perhaps with government incentive, and this is, I think, a key thing, that if we want to change the nature of work and the kinds of jobs that we're creating, there are a variety of levers that the government has through taxation policy, rules and regulations. There's plenty of ways the government can push society in certain directions. And so ultimately, if we all agree that robots will do most of our manufacturing, and I think we have to agree that that's the case, then you are going to rapidly come to the conclusion that humans have to be more involved with non-manufacturing activity and non-routine accounting operations. Well, what does that leave you with? It leaves you with the kind of service economy that actually, luckily, the United States has a pretty strong one. But what this then means is that we have to encourage the creation of service jobs. We have to get rid of the stigma.
And make them stink less, basically.
And make them stink, yeah. Exactly. And but
give them some stability, give them a package, make them look like classic industrial era jobs that had that nice package of stuff.
By the way, in Japan, I would argue, and I'm not saying that they have a great economy, but service jobs in Japan are more valued than in the U.S. But I would say here's really the bad news in America today. I think, and I've seen surveys on this that back it up, that in general, people like consumers would prefer to interact with automation over the current level of human workers that they encounter. And so you see, this is, again, part of the diabolical race to the bottom. The data says otherwise. So the data says that when you basically, when people don't have jobs, they
kill themselves.
They kill themselves.
Slightly oversimplified.
Yeah, that's right. Or kill other people.
I think we do need to be careful about very simple cause and effect relationships here. There's something about lives and families and communities where the structures of the industrial era have gone away that lead to some worrying things. And to Tommy's.
But in particular, here is actually my worry about this pathway. Up to now, and for thousands and thousands of years, we have distributed the wealth of society based primarily, but not always, on work that people do.
Labor income.
Labor income. And that's how we decide who gets what. And now you cannot just wave your hand and say, well, now we're going to switch over the next 10 years to a system where some government bureaucrat,
something else happens.
Yeah, or is going to decide how much money you get in your UBI, because who will make that decision? And so so I think the thinking here is very naive, because essentially what you're trying to do is to restructure something that we've perfected over 10,000 years in 20 years.
Yeah.
Okay, but again, we're actually talking.
There's a difference. I think we can all agree that having both meaningful work and a strong safety net would be the ideal condition. A question that I don't know the answer to is, what if you have that safety net, but work goes away at a very large scale?
And I can comment
I'm still worried about that.
And I can comment on the European economy. And so again, we're not talking about that today at this point in time. So the question is, but as this trend continues, say for 20, 30 more years, what will the picture be? and what are the policies that are needed, because enacting these changes takes a considerable amount of time. And I know a little bit about this from my own profession, that it is absolutely not the case that Europe has solved these problems. In particular, arguably Europe is bankrupting itself in its economic policy. And so at the moment, the situation in Europe, by some measures, from essentially societal fairness and happiness, is better, but by many measures, it's completely unsustainable.
You wanted to jump in here. Hold on. Someone's been trying to get in here for a while.
I would agree, but for sure. But I think that the issue that I'm confident that the issue that we have is the transition problem. So we are in one state, and we need to a different state. Now that transition, and so first of all, we don't know.
And do you share my belief that we're not working hard enough on that transition problem?
Precisely.
Okay.
And so so there are, I am an optimist, and so I'm very in agreement with most of the views being given here that there is another state that that will work for our society, but there may not be, first of all, agreement on what that state is. So step number one, we need to first of all estimate how quickly automation and AI will push us into that state. And number two, we have to get some kind of agreement on what that state should be. Number three, we have to do the economic analysis to make sure that that state is stable and not a mythical dream. And then number four, we have to gradually, we have to find a path to that state that does not involve war or famine or other bad things, because often in our world these state changes involve millions of people dying and complete restructuring of society. We all know the history of modern times.
Yeah.
Who's we?
We, are, for example, MIT. No, I mean, basically this is a research problem. The answer is, academia, government. It's a collective problem. There's no. I think that the United States, we have actually a fairly self-contained economy, so that the trade issues and other things are relatively minor. Mostly because it's a heavily service-oriented economy to begin with. That we have the benefit of being able to work on this problem without having to take into account the entire planet Earth. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. But Mark, also to your question, my favorite universe of analysis for thinking about different approaches here is the good old-fashioned country. I think we'll see very different approaches, country by country, as opposed to region by region, as opposed to either global region or within a country region.
Right, but if your country were smaller or more dependent upon essentially globalization, then the problem is actually harder, because then you need more core. So this is the problem in Europe, which is because Europe is some hybrid thing which will interfere with state change.
One of the dismaying things to me is that it's not just the workforce that is getting polarized in America. The evidence is very clear. Political parties are moving steadily farther apart, and our ability, like you say, to come together and make some big decisions, that ability is decreasing instead of increasing. And when you look at previous big technology transitions in the economy or in other economies, what you see is that the country came together and made some pretty big choices. My favorite example is universal primary education in America. Big decision, extremely controversial at the time, turns out to have been the right thing to do. But I don't even see us coming together to try to collectively figure out what the big decisions are. There's way too much of, if you say it, I disagree because you're blue and red.
But they're all, I agree completely, but there are also small decisions people can make as well. And so when, for example, MIT students are thinking about, companies to found and start, more people can be encouraged in their education to think about activities that might benefit from the use of human labor rather than activities that are trying to automate away and reduce.
And a tiny bit of self-promotion exactly on that front. Erik Brynjolfsson, Tommy, that's how to pronounce his name. And the rest of us at the Initiative on the Digital Economy, which is school, we've launched a thing called the Inclusive Innovation Challenge, where we're exactly trying to highlight the entrepreneurs and the innovators who are creating economic opportunity for good old-fashioned middle American people via tech progress.
That's right, and you know, because one thing that I find interesting when I talk about this, people say, "Then give me 10 ideas for companies that would benefit from increased." And I'll say, "Well, wait a minute. You know, why do you think I would know this?
Right. Let's crowdsource that.
Let's crowdsource it, just like we do all inventive activities.
Right.
So don't expect me to have the answer."
The previous history of universal basic income experiments in America, anyway, is not an encouraging one. We did a couple studies, a couple efforts in Seattle and Denver in the 60s and 70s. And yes, yeah, it's a basic, no questions asked basic income to a set of families, and then didn't do it for another set of families. I forget, it was a government effort. Maybe I don't know if it was state or federal level, but it absolutely happened. And the results were that people who got that money, they worked fewer hours, and I'm oversimplifying. They withdrew from the labor force even more, which I think is the wrong direction, and their marriages fell apart at a higher rate, which I also think is.
I think part of the problem here is the push and the pull, and again, this I think points out some policymaker issues. So the employers like to say that the problem is that we don't have enough trained workers, we don't have people who are right, but the workers then even if they get retrained, can't find the employers, and so there's a bit of finger pointing here. But I think the does show is it a labor demand problem or a labor supply problem? By the way, I think you're making an excellent point, and this is not something that we've talked about, which is, and this is kind of unrelated in a way to AI and automation. It's just the pace of change in our society has rapidly accelerated. It took, I like this analogy. It took something like half a generation or more before the telephone became integrated into routine human activity. And so that gave businesses, everyone, pretty much their working lifetime to adjust to the impact of being able to make a telephone call. And which is great. And now in our new society, you're expected, because we're very innovative and things are changing very rapidly, to constantly be able to incorporate these new technologies and ideas into traditional activities. This becomes overwhelming for people. So one reason I believe, no data on this, that you have a withdrawal from the workforce is, we're just exhausted. It's like, I don't want to get more retraining. I can't do it. It's like every time I get retrained, you tell me I have to retrain for something else. I mean, there's evidence that essentially people are just simply discouraged that they can't keep up. Yeah, well, I'll make an analogy. So if you install a robot in your factory, you do that with care, and you're not going to throw it away the next year because it was an investment, not only the cost of the robot, but programming it, fitting it into the process. So you're going to cherish your robot and use it for its lifetime, and then you'll retire it, and then I actually buy them on eBay, and I have a collection of these service robots that did good work in factories. But and so the robots is the weird thing. We're giving robots careers, but with people it's like, oh, you can come and go. If you business trails off a little bit, I'll lay you off. Who's going to take their robot and put it out on the street? But you put it. So there is actually. So what I mean by jobs versus careers is a job is basically very transactional. That you would basically, it's employment at will. It's the more of the American way versus the European way, I guess, or the Japanese way. But a career is where you're going to nurture, if you have a robot, you're going to have someone taking good care of it, oiling it every day, improving the programming to make it more efficient. But so these days, oddly, we're developing a much more intimate relationship and caring relationship for our automation, and much if an employee has a bug, you fire the employee. If your software has a bug, you very carefully fix it.
There's another edge to that story.
Right, Mark. I think that you may be drawing too much into the particular circumstances of your business. So another problem in our economy is that there are a very small number of job skills that are in high demand. And, and that's, sort of the stuff that you do, anything involving machine learning, big data. So because everyone wants to hire these people, and there just isn't a big enough supply, you have that problem. But in a much more balanced economy, I think that workers are much more likely to be loyal because they're not, why they're quitting because they're getting phone calls from 10 companies trying to hire them because there aren't enough trained workers. Well, look. I think that the turnover rate that you have in a company is the result of a bunch of factors, not just worker disloyalty. I think that it's a complicated question, and it has a lot to do with weight. Look, we've studied this problem pretty carefully. And usually it is, you have higher turnover, the data would show, in an industry that is having rapid wage growth. Because what happens is that it's very hard for you to get compensation correct in an organization if you're essentially having quick wage escalation and you don't want to completely readjust everyone, and it leads to unfairness and so on. People get larger offers. And so the real turnover problem generally occurs in business areas where wages are growing quickly, and that's just usually, as your data shows, that's not a particularly big part of the economy.
Economists tend to like churn. They tend to like people changing jobs. They tend to like labor force flexibility and fluidity a great deal. So my economist colleagues would actually get nervous if we started to see people only having 30, 40-year stable careers. That would probably be, we take that as a leading indicator that things were heading in the wrong direction.
But back to I didn't really answer, Josh, your question. So what I meant by career, and again, I think that this actually reduces turnover, at least that's been my own experience, that if employees feel like they have a pathway to wage growth and skill growth in the organization, then that I think is first of all, it's good investment in human beings, but secondly, it lead to lower turnover. We survey all employees that are exiting our company, and one of the top reasons that we don't have very much turnover, but one of the top reasons given is like new opportunity elsewhere. It's something that they can't do. In other words, complaint would be, put another way, maybe stagnation.
Yeah. Reid Hoffman, who's a LinkedIn founder and very good venture capitalist, has a nice way to think about that. He says we should maybe think about careers as consisting of successive tours of duty, and you and your employer should have a handshake agreement when you start work about what's the tour of duty consist of, how long is it going to be, what's each side's responsibility, and at the end of that, if you want to sign up together for another tour of duty, go do that. I kind of like that as a mental way to approach that, as opposed to saying, wow, we should have long careers or we should have tons of short churn. This notion of a tour of duty is helpful to me.
Right. And now I think that if you have wage growth, so if you can offer wage growth to employees, that is that's a good thing. So in a way,
wage growth solves so many problems.
So you could almost define giving someone a career as giving them the opportunity to have wage growth. And so then you have to be your business to see how you can design your company and do that.
Go ahead. Despite having written 2 books, we're still not clear. Let me try to say a couple things about that. You're right that the tone between the 2 books that Eric and I wrote changed. And the reason for that is that we think the lead is that technological progress is a profoundly good thing. And in the second machine age, we wanted to tell that story first and try to communicate the bounty that comes very powerful technologies, because I get way too many calls from journalists who want to write the robots are eating our jobs and therefore aren't the robots terrifying story. I think that's just getting it deeply wrong. Economists will admit that they blew the argument on trade, and therefore protectionism is back. It's failing Econ 101. It's a deeply terrible idea, but because the smart people didn't find a way to articulate the arguments, now we're talking about trade barriers and stuff like that. So the reason that we tried to lead with the case for optimism and for liking tech is because that's the big story. The things that we've been talking about here are an important consequence, I believe, of technological progress, and we need to talk about that along the lines that we've been doing this afternoon. Now, to your question about education, it's a great question. I think deeply rethinking education is a necessary condition, but not a sufficient one. What we need to do is, I think, twofold. We need to get faster economic growth, because faster economic growth, like we said earlier, solves so many other problems. Right? And so doing that is an urgent thing. The other thing we need to do, and this gets to some of our comments earlier, and I'll be a little parochial and talk about America, we need to rethink our safety. It's all messed up. And your health benefits, your retirement benefits, all these things are way too tied to whether or not you have a classic industrial era job. It's just very, very inappropriate. In addition to which, Eric, my co-author, has a really nice way to say it. We are not anywhere near peak labor. Nowhere near peak labor. Bob, we might get there in the next 66 years. I think that we will, but we're not there now, and there is no shortage. Peak labor would be when, to grow the economy, the number of hours worked has plateaued and is now going down year by year. We are not near that point, but no stretch of the imagination. The number of hours worked grows in lockstep with the growth of the overall economy. When those two lines decouple, then we're in a very different era of our history. We ain't there yet. And there's no shortage of additional things that need to be done. We need to be educating people better. The way we take care of our elderly, I think, is a moral scandal. The number of elderly Americans who don't talk to another human being for days on end is staggeringly large. We got to take care of these people who are killing themselves quickly and slowly. There is no shortage of work to be done. Will market forces and entrepreneurs do all that work for us? I'm an ardent capitalist. I don't believe they will. Larry Summers has a great phrase. He says, there's not really a great business model for educating the children of very poor people. So these are things that we can take on as a society and absolutely do. Let me say one more thing. And we are wealthy enough as a society to start doing this work that needs to be done. And I don't think that takes us down the road to crazy socialism like some of my more libertarian friends think. So for all those reasons, if we did this hard work and got the policy environment right, a lot of these things that I was talking about, I don't know if they'd go away. I'm pretty confident they would be eased a little. And we have enough time to figure out what a meaningful life and a healthy community look like when they are no longer dominated by work. I think we're going to see that. I'll see that world before I die. We're not going to see it in the next decade plus. I do not believe that, even with Mark's 5-year horizon truck unloading robot.
Yeah, and to add to your point, there's all this talk about the need for improved infrastructure, in the country, and so that the kind of work involved with improving the infrastructure, I believe, Mark, is going to be relatively hard to automate, in the next 10 years.
And it's exactly the kind of work that would get these brawny, these stereotypically brawny American men off the sidelines.
But here we go back to the structure of the economy question. So it would seem sensible to me that we should continue to be importing all these great stuff at low cost from China and other countries, and take essentially these workers and get them involved with infrastructure. So why doesn't that happen? So the way we rigged up our economy is that there is no revenue model for most infrastructure. So for example, replacing sewers, building roads, and so on, by and large, it doesn't generate revenue the way when a company sells a product, they can get people to directly pay for it. And so what we have is, again, just because of the way we've rigged up our incentive system, we have disincentive for employing people in building infrastructure.
You have to go way outside of mainstream economists. You have to go way to the left or way to the right before you'll find any decent economist who doesn't believe that government should be paying for sewers and infrastructure like that. Those are fringe weirdos who don't believe that. Yeah, it's called
Yeah.
it's called tax.
Yeah, but no, this is why I think we can go on all night, but I mean, I think one of the reasons we're killing ourselves here is that the things that we really need that would employ a lot of workers, we don't want to have a revenue model for. And the only way we want to pay for them is with taxes. But at the same time, people don't want to pay taxes. They want to have their money to buy, other things. And so this seems like a diabolical policy bind here.
No, be careful. Basically, most other rich countries don't have this particular bind. This is a particularly weird.
Oh,
American.
sorry, I'm talking about America.
I understand that, but that's not any. It's not any insoluble policy bind.
I agree.
It's the fact that too many people don't think that
agree.
infrastructure is a thing. Evidently,
I totally agree.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, our corporate tax rates, they're high on paper and in reality. It's a full employment bill for really, really good accountants. So actually getting companies to pay their fair share would be massively revenue generating. Use that to improve our bridges and put people to work, and then we have better bridges. Look, this is not even Econ 101, right? Alan Blinder is a really good economist, and his law is that the areas where economists agree the most are where they're listened to the least. And infrastructure is exhibit A for that. That my headline is "Don't stop innovating." Right? Tech.
We agree about
Okay, but I just want to say because very often people say, "Look, the innovators need to slow the pace of what they're doing, so we have a chance to catch our breath." I don't believe
I
that.
have this dream that eventually, how do we get there?
Well, look, so a simple suggestion that I would make, which I think is easy, is that the people here at MIT should spend some extra time in trying to be realistically communicate to the world, not in academic journals, but
That's right.
About what to expect, and not the Kurzweil way of doing
That's
it,
right.
because that's that it just is a fog and confusing, but level-headed, just the way you're doing it. But I think there can be a much broader dialogue in society to raise awareness of what's happening in a realistic way.
If you all make the same mistake economists make, you've got a very serious problem, and shame on you. Because economists have shown what not to do. They just lost the debate on trade. If the technologists lose the debate on tech progress, we have two very serious problems instead of just one. It's tough because we don't just need to keep talking to each other. Right? I think that's a failure mode that's very easy to get into, and I think we've learned how dangerous that can be.
Well, I mean, look, I think that that little op-ed I wrote in the New York Times, I was surprised at how much attention it generated. When I considered it to be actually, really just stating the obvious.
Tommy, I would say both advancing and broadening the conversation and working really hard on both those things is important. If all of us, people at elite academic institutions just keep talking to each other, massively insufficient.
Look, and the other thing I would add, which just to repeat what I stated, and this is more of an MIT thing or a broader university, throughout America, is that I think that there should be more emphasis, particularly in entrepreneurialism, to try to get people solving a more diverse set of problems.
Yep.
I think it's become too narrowly focused.
Oh, and we're celebrating too narrow a thing, which is the next app or the next Snapchat.
That's
right?
right.
Let's broaden out that celebration.
I just one thing I like to point out about how this works. One example I like to give is like Facebook. So Facebook, everyone in America uses it, or, mostly everyone in the world, and people I think in America use it for an average of 20 minutes a day, maybe more. And and this company is only employing 25,000 people to serve this global community of 3 or 4 billion users. So we can kind of round down the number of people they're employing to zero, and generating consuming 20 minutes. Or I think it's even more on average of our time, and so those are 20 minutes that we can't consume other activities. So essentially, imagine if everyone is focusing on this Facebook app, where to try to get people, billions of people to spend 20 minutes a day, using it. I mean, maybe you have 10 of these apps, and eventually all we're doing is, and then you'll have a collapse in economic activity.
One of the other scary things in the economy, entrepreneurship is on the decline in America, and Silicon Valley distracts us because it's so bright and shiny and alluring. Good old-fashioned entrepreneurship is on the decline, and the reason that's really scary is that young, high-growth companies have been one of the big job creation and wage growth engines in the economy. Here's the scarier part: we don't understand very well why entrepreneurs decline. It feels like death by 1,000 cuts, but we actually don't understand it very well. So this, there's so many different ways to look at it. Any measure you want to capture of new venture formation, new establishment creation, new company creation, percentage of Americans employed by young companies, they're all on a long, slow, steady 20-year decline. And figuring out how to reverse that is more research is needed is kind of a stock phrase. More research is desperately needed here. You've been super patient. Thank you all.